All right, I think we have everybody here. So as folks filter in, we'll actually just go ahead and kick things off. First and foremost, thanks to everybody for joining this afternoon. We're excited to walk through our intelligence platform and our AI chat with everybody today. By way of introduction, my name's Cooper Hardy. I sit on our platform team here at Morning Consult, and my job is really to help organizations and individuals access the daily data that we're collecting around the world. So, just for a frame of reference, every single day we're interviewing about 15,000 individuals in over 40 of some of the largest economies in the world. And we're asking them questions about politics, about economics, about their behaviors and preferences, and about a number of different brands. What we do with that data is that we actually help organizations use it and access it in a meaningful way to make better decisions as quickly as possible. Over time, we've collected about 80 million historical surveys, um, covering all sorts of different topics, about 4.8 billion questions. And really, the focus with Morning Consult is to understand what is happening in the world in real time. We recognize that there's a lot of uncertainty, whether it's political, whether it's economic. And the number one thing we're hearing from our partners and from other leading organizations is that there is a need for data in real time to be forward looking and to proactively address challenges that are arising, if not by the day, by the hour. And what we'll do today within the platform itself is we'll actually use our AI chat that we've opened up to the public, and we'll put in a link to the chat itself to better understand the trends that are impacting consumers, how perhaps political and ideological shifts are impacting preferences, how American brands are performing internationally, and ultimately how brands in moments of high intensity or perhaps high crisis can act and leverage our data to better understand the ramifications and the actions they might take. As we think about the data and the actual demo we'll go through today, it's really helpful to understand that all of the AI functionality that we've built to unlock this data, right, is powered by retrieval augmented generation here of our historical interviews, right? Across each interview, we're asking questions around favorability and trust and purchase consideration to give really a 360-degree view, not only of consumers, but also of organizations and brand performance. As we dive in here, the biggest realization we've actually had is that with this abundance of data, there's a need for quicker speed to insight. There's a need to better understand how to act rapidly, right? And there's a need to do that in a conversational manner. That is where our AI functionality comes into play, right? Allowing users really just to have a conversation with our data and answer the questions that are most pressing to them. So what we'll actually do here is we'll pop into the tool, and I should flag as we jump in, if there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section, and we'll be sure to address them as well. But what we're jumping into right here, this is our AI, our intelligence platform. Again, everybody can leverage this. We've opened this up for public access. And just to give a quick tour and quick sort of tutorial, it's all conversational. Feel free to just drop whatever you would like in the chat itself. But if you're looking for maybe how do I know if my brand is tracked, right? If you're looking for specific data cuts or questions, I would encourage you to look at our prompt library and our help and support functionality to really get a sense of what is available to you right now. So what we'll do is we'll actually just walk through this experience here. And I think it's helpful to go through layers of, of questions to get to the level of granularity that is helpful for organizations. So we'll start with something just very high level, like do Americans think the country is headed in the right direction or on the wrong track, just to give us a sense of what this data interface looks like. Again, this will query our historical interviews. This will look at all the data we have, right? And you can see very quickly, this is just an aggregate view of our data itself. This is, almost 7 million interviews on these questions, right? What I view as really, really helpful is actually looking at some of the trend data. So again, a lot of what we're thinking about is how can we be forward looking and how can we be proactive? So I'm just going to ask our tool to actually trend that data over time to better understand the movement of this question in and of itself, this right direction, wrong track. So we see clear and certainly not surprising where some of this movement happens with a recent presidential election. What we're doing here is we're actually looking at the trend, but we'll provide an analysis and narrative for users as well. So we can see the movement, right? But what we ultimately want to get to is like, how is this impacting our consumers? How is this changing the way people are thinking about different brands and different decision making? So I always like to think about the larger groups we can start with to get to a level of granularity. So maybe we're curious about, the actual underlying party IDs that are driving these changes. So I'll actually have us look at, what does this question in and of itself, how does that change if you're a Democrat or if you're a Republican or if you're an independent voter? Right? Again, perhaps not wildly surprising in alignment with the recent election. We can see, again, very large sample sizes here. This is spanning back to 2021. We're looking at Democratic respondents, we're looking at independent respondents, and we're looking at these Republican respondents themselves. We're seeing that shift again, aligning very closely with the recent election. What this question leads to for me as I think about this is, all right, I want to understand where my consumers are, and I want to understand if some of these underlying changes are reflected just in this question or a consumer base at large. So as we work through this, I would like to see, maybe is the political sort of ID of the nation as a whole, is that shifting with recent news, with recent events? So we're actually going to look at the trends of party ID to better understand where are people moving with their alignment as these news stories, as these events occur across the board. What we see is this data stays fairly flat across the general population, right? But when we think about our consumers, we want to understand some of those individuals with the largest buying power, with the increasing amount of wallet share. So maybe we look at this by generation. Again, all of this data is powered by our underlying surveys where we're asking these questions around politics, around brands, around economics, and behaviors. Immediately, what jumps out to me and what we're seeing in our data across the board is that, America and Gen Z in particular is becoming a little less liberal, right? As we see this sort of change over time, particularly in recent months. So again, we'll have our data here, but what we can see is that there's a dip in Democratic identification among Gen Z, right? And that Republican identification is growing markedly, 16% to 29% within our most recent data. So if Gen Z's the largest, have some of the most quickly growing buying power, right? If they're shifting perhaps a bit more conservatively, the next question I would be curious about is like, how do we connect with that growing group? How do we better understand how to communicate with them? And how do we ultimately understand, do they have money in their pockets to spend? So the first question of that is like, maybe we're curious about what social media apps Gen Z Republicans are using, right? How do we craft a message to connect with them? how do we ultimately communicate with them in a meaningful manner? Right. So that would be my first, like, how can this channel analysis, right? So we're seeing they're over indexing on YouTube, on Instagram, and on TikTok, certainly along generational lines to an extent. But again, another way to think about where are these people spending their time? How are they getting their news? And how might we craft a message that resonates with them? And then the final step of this is just, do these individuals have money in their pocket? Are they bullish on the economy? Do they feel comfortable when it comes to their short-term and long-term views of their purchasing power? Um, and we can actually get to that level of granularity within this data set. So I will just ask about their economic outlook. We can trend this however we like. I would like to trend it monthly, right? Just to get a sense of how that is moving, right? And again, these underlying surveys that we're powering, right? We're asking questions about economic outlook, about the index of consumer sentiment, and breaking out each of those components for you all. So again, we can see personal finances. That's where I'm most curious. A recent peak among this group in terms of, they're actually feeling that they will be better off moving forward. We can see that they expect business conditions to improve in the short term and in the long term as well. Right. So as we work through this, my biggest thought and what we hear from our partners the most is it's really, really valuable to get a sense of some of this top line macro data, but we're also really, really curious around these segments that might be growing, that might be changing and might be shifting. That's just one application of our AI tool, how it can be leveraged and how it can be used immediately for folks today. The other question we're hearing very, very frequently is just in relation to perceptions of the United States and American brands internationally. We're running these surveys again in over 40 different markets and 40 of the largest economies, right? And we're, tracking not only brand performance and economic outlook, but we're actually tracking perceptions of countries themselves and how perhaps the affinity of certain countries and certain products, right, is impacted by the changing perceptions of those countries. So just for example's sake, we're thinking about some of the United States, biggest trade partners and regional partners. If we're curious about the net favorability of the United States in some of these markets, we can actually just type that in here. And we'll say China, Canada, and Mexico. And we'll just say over the last year. We'll be querying this data. Again, this is looking across all of the different surveys we're running. And we're seeing across the board a general decline, right? Certainly in Canada and Mexico, very clear. What we see in China here, this is actually in direct relation, this sort of peak here to some of the conversation around tariff rollbacks, right? That's how frequently we are collecting this data. We can detect those changes, right? And this is just to get a sense of, all right, as we think about positioning our brand in some of these international markets and some of these neighboring markets, how does being an American brand change perceptions? Are there underlying currents that might impact what we're seeing? The answer clearly is yes. There are things at play here that are impacting the brands, right? But we're also, when we're thinking about the consumers, we're probably most curious about consumer level, like spending and the income levels that we're selling into. So perhaps we're curious in consumer spending in Canada. We want to better understand what the different levels and their changes look like. So why don't we say did So we'll ask, let's actually look at these different segments, right? Let's think about where was the biggest change. And again, we can just type that right in. But what we see is these high income consumers, who generally some of these top line consumers will buoy a lot of sentiment data, have seen the largest decrease in favorability towards the US in the past year. Right. So as we bear in mind the sort of business opportunity and the business risk, clear movement among those higher income segments, certainly across the board, but on the higher income segment as well. As we move forward, I personally am just very, very curious about like the actual elements that are driving some of these changes, right? One of the number one questions we receive as an organization uh, is like, how are tariffs impacting our business? We've actually stood up distinct tariff trackers with our analyst team, but we've also started looking at that question and boycott behavior among consumers, right, in our daily tracking as well. So I'm always curious, like specific types of products or specific brands, but you know, maybe we're just like really curious of like have maybe soda drinkers in Mexico boycotted US products more than others due to tariffs and due to the changing geopolitical and economic situation. So again, we're just going to query our data here and we're going to look through the set itself, right? And we're actually able to see right away, right, how that change has impacted people who are drinking soda in Mexico. One thing I'll just note as we dive into this, we added this question into our daily tracking in April around the impact of tariffs in a number of different markets, right? We've already collected almost 10,000 responses for, people who are drinking soda on a daily or weekly basis in Mexico and how they're changing their behavior. One question that's sort of come into the chat as we've been working on this is just limitations of this product and what can we search, what actually should be kept in mind. Again, this is querying our historical data set, 80 million historical interviews, the ongoing daily data that we're collecting within our intelligence platform. And the underlying power is that larger platform itself. So many people who may be familiar with some of our analyst content that I mentioned, where our team of economists, our team of political analysts, of consumer analysts are writing curated content, right? That actually lives outside of this platform. This is just looking at our daily surveys itself. Organizations who would like to access the full suite of analysis plus dashboarding plus intelligence platform itself certainly have the opportunity to do so. But at a top line, the AI chat itself is just looking at those underlying daily surveys that we're running. So what we've done here is we've sort of taken a look at some of the international behavior in as a result of political activity. We can also do that just looking in the U.S. again if we want to bring this sort of lens a little bit closer to home. One of the things we're hearing very much about again is just social issues. How should my company address these social issues? What might be a potential risk or what might be an opportunity? We are looking at boycott behavior at specifically in relation to social issues in the US as well. So if we're curious of what percentage of Americans have boycotted a product or product due to a company's stance, we can actually find that data for you to provide that directional guidance. Again, the goal here is to provide that sort of larger view of consumers and to actually provide the clarity as to what's happening in the world and how is it impacting my brand. The final piece of this sort of conversation is like that direct impact on brand itself, right? how do we know a crisis is emerging? How can we address that crisis, whether that's locally or internationally? And how do we measure both the short tail and the long tail of that impact? One example of perhaps an organization at a moment of high intensity is Tesla, right? And recent activity of Elon Musk and sort of the brand as a whole. So if we're curious about like how are things changing actually for Tesla and how can we identify where that movement is happening, we can actually just chat this in and we'll say, all right, how is Tesla changing in the US based on recent events, but also in these international markets with some of these trading partners, right? What does that look like? It's a very interesting story, and a reason that our global data is incredibly important is because the story is different in each market. For example, right, we've seen a general decline in Canada, in Germany, and the US, but we've actually seen an overall increase in net favorability for Tesla over the past 4 years in China. We've seen a recent dip, but the trend has largely been positive over 4 years. We'll see how that data continues to evolve, right, over time. I think it's one thing to think about like, do people actually like a brand? But will they actually consider purchasing a product from that brand as well? So we can just think about how individuals are changing their purchasing habits, again, in relation to Tesla. And we can trend this data however we want. Let's just look quarterly to make it as clear as possible. We'll let the platform work through it. Again, the goal here is to provide clarity as to some of the larger movement and the trends that we're seeing within specific audiences, within specific markets, right? And to provide sort of forward-looking lens of how can we anticipate changes moving forward, right, as a brand, as an organization. When we think about unlocking audience insights, the other piece of this is let's get granular with these behaviors. Let's get granular with actual, the consumers that matter the most to us, right? So for example, Tesla probably not like super curious about the general population, but what about people who actually intend to buy an electric vehicle? Again, we're running this daily survey. We're asking these questions of consumers on a daily basis. We're able to get to that level of intention and that level of clarity based on the collection that we're doing. And finally, we can zoom it out again. We're looking at a brand. We're thinking about, are people who are going to buy an EV, are they considering Tesla? How has that changed over time? We've seen a bit of a decrease, right? But maybe we just want to take this all the way back to the top of our conversation and say, like, are the people who are actually considering buying an EV or who currently have an EV, are they changing from the political standpoint, right? So what's the party ID among electric vehicle owners versus current electrical vehicle owners, right? Right. So we can actually see what that change looks like. We've seen much more volatility, as you can probably imagine, among with Democrats who have seen a drastic drop versus Republicans, and then some more continuity with individuals who currently own an EV. With that's sort of a spin through a few different applications and use cases of the tool itself. The overwhelming thought or idea I would like to leave folks with is that this is a very powerful tool. It's a very rapid tool when you need a quick answer, right? And our goal is to be a resource for organizations as we navigate these sort of rapidly evolving times. At MorningConsult, we consider ourselves a decision intelligence company, and the really critical element of making meaningful decisions right now is having contextual data, having that ongoing measurement, and having the ability to look at trends and movement over time to better understand what has happened and what might happen so we can proactively address and acknowledge potential opportunities, potential challenges, and potential areas of importance for our business. With that, I think there are some questions in the chat, so we can actually walk through things here. I see a question around actual use case. Like, are people using this tool on a daily basis? Is this long-term monitoring? Is this short-term? The answer is it really will vary from user to user and by organization. But primarily, what we're seeing organizations do is use this tool to address immediate change in short-term events, short-term happenings, short-term sort of challenges that the business might face, and then leveraging the tool in a longer tail basis to see has has our brand favorability returned to normal? Is there still a lot of buzz associated with our brand itself? How is that moving among different groups? So for many, it's an immediate security blanket, right? And a long-term sort of barometer or measurement to better understand that movement itself. There's another question here quickly around consumer sentiment data. As I mentioned, we're collecting about 5,000 responses every single day in the US, about 10,000 responses worldwide, looking at each component and the overall index of consumer sentiment around the world. In the platform itself, we are only showing the components of our index, right? And via AI chat, if you were to subscribe into the intelligence platform as a whole, you'd have that ongoing index, right? That combines all of the components. So we'll just again reprompt this. What we'll have here is just a breakout of that economic data. Again, when we think about who are our consumers, where are they spending their time, and do they actually feel comfortable in what they might buy or in their current economic outlook, this is a really, really meaningful data set to help answer those questions. I saw a question about brands and where can we see if we're tracking a certain brand as well. I will direct everybody over here to just the search function for the brands, right? We can just type in really whatever we would like. We're tracking about 5,000 brands around the world. So the opportunity is very likely that we're covering a brand. If not, please feel free to reach out. Organizations who subscribe to the platform can certainly request to add brands and add coverage in markets of importance as well. But I believe if that's I'm looking through the questions here, I believe that's it for what we were planning on covering today. Once again, thank you for joining and spending time with us. We are here to be a resource for our partners, for organizations. We recognize that things are changing around the world in a really rapid manner, right? And we believe that MorningConsult is uniquely positioned to be a resource and to provide immediate value for you all as you navigate these changes. So please don't hesitate to reach out if there are any questions, but thank you to everybody again for the time, and I hope everybody has a lovely afternoon.